All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk. I'm glad you could join us. My name is Daniel Messmer. I work with the German-American Institute here in Tübingen, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. Tonight will be a talk on women in retro film and television, and I'm really excited about this talk. But before we dive into the topic, I just want to give you a couple of pointers of what you might do with your free time in the coming days and weeks. Because it is Women's History Month, we have a couple of things planned, a couple of really nice collaborations with other institutes. And I want to mention a couple of those to you before we start. But before we do that, the most important news on our end is that you are now finally able to come see our great exhibition, Am I What You're Looking For? Great photographies by d.a.i, who portray women of color who struggle with everyday racism and hurdles that prevent them from working in a way that they want. And this struggle was portrayed by d.a.i in beautiful and stunning photographies that you can see now at the German-American Institute. Unfortunately, you still have to make an appointment for the time being, but you can do so on our website, and you will find the link below in the video description on YouTube, or you can go to www.dai-tübingen with a ue.de. Additionally, what we have planned on March 23rd is a collaboration with the US Consulate General in Frankfurt and the d.a.i in Stuttgart, our sister institution in Stuttgart. And it is an online film screening and a discussion called Ground Control to Meta Mars, the Future of Diversity in Space, which looks at the space exploration as a feminist issue and tries to shed a light on what is happening there. That happens on March 23rd at 6:30 p.m. And you can find all info on our website as well. And then on March 31st, we have a great talk on Black women claiming political power in the US, organized by the Consulate General of Frankfurt, and that will take place at 7 p.m. And again, you can find all info on that on our website. Then another info for those of you who are watching on Zoom right now, you can ask questions for later in the Q&A feature that Zoom has to offer. So you can find a button below the video that either says F&A or Q&A, depending on which language your computer is set to. And you can ask questions there that we can then answer later. But moving over to tonight's topic. I'm sure a lot of you have watched shows like Mad Men. Cable Girls was fairly popular. That just ended, I think, last year. We had The Queen's Gambit, which for a while, I think, was Netflix's most successful show ever. You have The Crown, you have The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So there's a lot of shows at the moment that are set in the 1950s, in the past, that have a lot of female characters, either in their leads or as supporting characters. And a lot of the time, those representations are seemingly historically accurate, but not always unproblematic. And I'm really glad that tonight we have an expert on the topic with us. Debarchana Baruah is with the American Studies Department at the University of Tübingen, and she wrote her Ph.D. dissertation on 21st century retro Mad Men and 1960s America. So she really is an expert on the topic. And I hope that she can tonight shed some light on this really interesting topic. And with that, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much and enjoy tonight's talk.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Let's first see if I can share my screen. Okay. Do you guys see my screen? Okay, so I was invited to give a talk on the topic of women's representation in film and television, a topic I'm sure each of us have something to say about. And so I was only too happy to add my 2 cents. I also wanted to further complicate women's representation by not only addressing the categories of race and ethnicity and class, but also to bring in this element of time to the discussion. Asking the question, how are women who are temporarily separated from us represented in period films and television? So what I did was so my talk will be divided into 2 parts. The first part will go through some of the characteristics of female representations in film and television, and the second part will specifically address female representations in period productions. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with some of the very obvious things that we notice immediately when we watch film and television. Yeah, the male to female ratio on screen. So what I did was, yeah, I picked up just 3 films from the 2019 Academy Award nominee list, and you basically get the picture, right? Most of these big budget films that are selected for excellence feature male character leads. According to the Gina Davis Institute of Gender in Media, women and girls are 51% of the population, but entertainment media is bereft of female characters with a ratio of approximately 3:1 male characters to female characters since the 1940s. Not only is the representation of male and female actors on screen unequal, but it is also widely known that male and female actors do not get paid as equal. So here is the film American Hustle, and the 3 protagonists, Christian Bale, Bradley Cooper, and Amy Adams, each work for similar amounts of time, about 45 days of filming. But while Bale and Cooper earned $2.5 million each and commanded 9% of the profits of the film, Adams was given only $1.25 million and 7% of the profits. Economist Sofia Sanchez and her collaborators, they analyzed the wages of 246 male and female actors who featured in 1,343 films between 1980 and 2015, and they found the gap to be more or less the same in 2015 as it was in 1980. And they were looking at really big names, the likes of Meryl Streep. And they also found that the gap only grew with age, something that Sanchez attributed to the beauty value of the market. From childhood to middle age, it remained at about 1 million, the difference. But when these stars turned 50, it increased to an average of just under $4 million per film. Other findings include the gap varies from genre to genre. For more male-driven genres such as the action film, the gap increased further. Male actors were paid around $1.8 million more than female actors. They were especially surprised to find the pay gap in genres such as rom-coms, because at least in that you would think that both men and women to be playing equally important parts, right? But of course not. So yeah, there too they found huge, substantial pay gaps. So we all know that the media is one of the most powerful cultural institutions that influence our view of the world, and this skewed gender ratio is just simply devastating. And this is without even considering representations of women who are old or of ethnic minorities or with non-binary sexual preferences. So this brings So to now move to the second point, maybe this is not as obvious, but um, this is about how much screen time is granted to female actors. And this, of course, affects their stature and pay, right? In a study done by machine learning experts at University of California, they found that women appear on average for just 36% of the total time that characters are on screen. And Oscar-winning films are even less representative, with women getting just 32% of screen time and 27% of speaking time in films that received an Academy Award. And using algorithms for voice and face recognition that run parallel, the program can analyze a feature film in less than 15 minutes. The software can also distinguish when one person is on screen, but someone else is talking, says one of the researchers, Shrikant Narayanan. He adds, often when women are speaking, it's actually the men that are shown on screen. So they analyzed over 300 films, and they found that the only genre in which women spend more time on screen than men was the genre of horror, and with female characters receiving 53% of screen time in such films. And we all know uh, women's role in horror films are usually confined to being sexualized victims, right? So in dramas, women were only on screen for an average of a third of the film. And for crime films, that figure dropped to less than a quarter. Their system didn't take into account any of these non-binary characters. So this was just about male and female characters. Um, the third point that I wanted to address is, even if women do appear on screen, how representative are they of their community? And I wanted to take Black women's representation as an example here. In the Gina Davis Institute's latest report published in 2021, they commented on the representation of Black female leads in film and television from 2019. And I picked three of their findings for discussion: presence of Black women on screen, skin tone, and hair. So according to the report, so they say on presence of Black female characters, the report adds Black girls and women are 6.5% of the US population, but they are only 3.7% of leads and co-leads in the 100 top grossing films each year from 2009 to 2019. And you can see that there has been some progress in the recent years from the graph. And on skin tone, they say that only 1 in 5 Black leading ladies have a darker skin tone. This confirms that Hollywood has a bias in favor of Black women with lighter skin in blockbuster films. The virtual erasure of dark-skinned Black women as leading ladies in blockbuster films has not improved in the past decade. And about hair, they found, which is obvious, I think it's an obvious factor, that Hollywood has a hairstyle bias. A solid majority of Black leading ladies are depicted with hairstyles that conform to European standards of beauty. Okay, so far we've talked about presence of women on screen, but let's look at what do they do with their screen time. So often, even when women do appear on screen, they are the passive recipients of a man's action. In the genre of action or thrillers, women are usually there to passively respond to the main event or to the heroic doings of the male lead. In the case of romances or rom-coms too, women often act as if without any agency, waiting for the man to fall in love with them. Most genres end up reproducing gender stereotypes. Men talk about their work and women talk about their relationships. So considering the persistence of these stereotypes, comic artist Alison Bechtel proposed a test with 3 simple classifications that surprisingly few movies met. The movies, like, they had to have at least 2 women in it, and they have to talk to each other, and they have to talk to each other about something besides a man. And this test was popularly known as the Bechdel test, and it quickly became a well-known parameter to judge the quality of a film and or television program. And although fairly simplistic, it was adopted by several film institutes as a first step towards ensuring gender equality in cinematic representations. Several other tests inspired by the Bechdel test has emerged since. Some aimed at assessing representations of ethnic minorities, such as the Nikesh Shukla test. Some assess the representation of Muslims on screen, such as the Riz Ahmed test, or the Duvernay test, which measures if African Americans and other minorities have fully realized lives rather than serving as scenery in white stories. And I found this really nice graph made by a Wikipedia user, Sandstein, and collating information published in 4 separate studies on gender inequality in US films. And I thought that it provides a very good visual representation of these really uncomfortable figures that we are talking about. And to come to my 5th and final point for the first part of the presentation, the male gaze. You simply cannot talk about representation of women in film and television without talking about the male gaze. It's a cinema theory which proposes that the female characters exist in films solely through the eyes of the male characters and for the pleasure of the male viewer. The phrase was coined by Laura Mulvey, British film critic. She was inspired by psychoanalytic theories of Freud and Lacan, and as well as the theories of John Berger, presented in his book Ways of Seeing. Berger, I think so, John Berger. Yeah, considering the ubiquity of the male gaze in media, some critics suspect that this sexualization of women is almost encoded in the very language of the camera, how the camera becomes the instrument through which the female body is seen, filmed, and consumed. Some has suggested that when enough women get behind the camera, the perspective is bound to change, but others are less optimistic, citing films made by women which reproduce the gaze. So yeah, this brings me to the end of my first part, and now we'll look at what happens when the story setting is pushed back in time. And we will revisit several of these points already discussed, such as the male to female ratio in film productions now set in the past. You must have observed that most historical productions usually revolve around a historic event or the lives of historic men. This is not surprising because traditionally, men were the primary writers and creators of history. History was essentially a telling of his story, right? The second reason for an overrepresentation of men in historical productions is their interest in the grand narratives of historical events and not in the, say, little off-center narratives of an individual's past. They stem from a commitment to memorialize a nation's decisive moments, wars of independence, political conquests, scientific achievements, human triumphs against nature, and so on. And I call these solemn histories in my book. These productions are distinct for their realism, their educational promise, as well as their reliance on tropes of the epic in terms of cinematography, music, cast, and budget. And Spielberg's big budget historical fictions can immediately be acknowledged as icons of the genre. In most of these narratives, men are placed at the center stage, especially in the genre of the war movie. The male to female ratio is almost abysmal. Women's presence in these productions are almost negligible, if not entirely absent. Sometimes, though, women are accommodated in the script as the love interest of the male lead, someone the hero returns to when the war is over. Often, this character also stands in to represent the female nurses involved in wars. And don't forget to keep the Bechtel test in the background of your mind, right? So, what do you think this woman's role is in this film, or what do you think she talks about for the most part of the film? About the men, of course. Um, yeah. So if you go through the list of historical films or period productions made in the last 2 to 3 decades, you will find that most cluster around the middle of the 20th century, largely spanning the war years up until the late 60s. Now, though, you do see some that go back to the 70s and the 80s, but they are still in the minority. So for the productions that revisit the events of the Second World War and the Holocaust, they are driven by their commitment to preserve memories and are therefore quite solemn in their approach, as already discussed, right? So these are the standardized historical fare of Allied victory, so to speak. But apart from these, there is a second set of productions that revisit the post-war years, usually going back to the 1950s, often portrayed as the innocent 50s or the conformist 50s. And of course, there are several productions that return to the 1960s, unambiguously represented as the decade of radical energy, the wellspring of progressive ideas upon which lay the foundations of contemporary America. Now, let's look at some of these examples of this second category. And since these are largely peacetime portrayals, one would imagine women would have some role to play here, right? So let's see what happens. So here is Jenny Curran from Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump is a favorite example because it appears so benign and innocent. The film kind of stirs clear of serious politics and is basically a very palatable, feel-good kind of a film. It is enamored by the 60s radical energy, but it stops short of directly participating in it. It briefly inserts a hippie female protagonist and her anti-war demonstrator friends to cursorily touch upon the 60s counterculture. Abby Hoffman is shown briefly in the movie, urging Gump to share his experiences of the Vietnam War in an anti-war protest at the Lincoln Memorial. But as Gump takes the stage to address the large gathering, the mic is unplugged and his voice becomes inaudible to the crowd, evincing the film's politics of self-censorship. It reconstructs the 60s as a string of iconic events. The narrative is so preoccupied by the aura of the events that, in spite of the ingenuity of the plot, it fails to grant its characters' interiority. Consequently, they inhabit the narrative only as stereotypes. Gump's girlfriend, Jenny Curran, played by Robin right here, is an apt example of the film's hasty treatment of the counterculture. She's a self-destructive hippie figure for the most part of the movie, who eventually reaches out to Gump to bring up their son as she's infected with a deadly virus, presumably HIV. A second example that we can consider is, just a minute. Catch Me If You Can. Once again, a very entertaining and stylistically made film. And like Forrest Gump, the action revolves around a man, of course, actually a teenager in this case, Frank Abagnale, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Frank is a very charming boy and is also a genius at forgery. Later, it is revealed that that had he applied himself, he could have achieved anything. He clears the Louisiana State Bar exam without any formal lessons and by just studying for a week or two. Part of his genius is also identifying naive young professionals who he charms to get information about the system that he hopes to defraud, such as banks, airlines, hospitals. The stress, however, throughout the movie is always on the male protagonist's charm and ingenuity, and most of the women characters play peripheral roles defined only by their naivete and without ever acknowledging them as employed professionals. And one cannot help but think it must have taken some amount of intelligence to make it as a professional woman in the 60s, right? But you don't see any of that coming through in the film. And here we see Brenda Strong, another woman Frank exploits. She's a nurse at a hospital that Frank joins, this time pretending to be a doctor. But if you look at these pictures, you already get that the plot intends to set Brenda up as a bit of a, how do I say, dimwit, or her uniform or her schoolgirl-like ponytails, her braces, all work together to infantilize her. Even though she is probably older than Frank and most definitely much more qualified than he is, she's still shown to be lacking in intelligence and judgment and is clearly his inferior. By Frank's design, the two eventually embark on a brief and unequal relationship. The first time they are about to have sex, sensing her reluctance, Frank asks her if she's a virgin. But we find out soon after that Brenda had a traumatic abortion and been ostracized by her family. But her characterization gives away none of her sexual experience and emotional turmoil. The temporal distance between these characters and us is somehow employed to as if legitimize the sexism in these portrayals. These portrayals want to convey to the contemporary audience that women then simply didn't know any better, that they were just unaware of their sexuality or of their capabilities and so on. Sometimes, though, the pendulum swings to the other way around, once again signaling a distorted view of the temporal distance. For example, the TV series Masters of Sex reproduces the binary of the naive housewife and the sexually liberated working woman. The naive housewife is like a throwback to the 50s kind of innocence or conformism and so on, and the sexually liberated woman is a reference to the 60s women, right? So this TV series set during the years from 1956 to 1969 tells the story of Dr. William Masters and Virginia Johnson, two early researchers of human sexuality. Masters is shown to be this introverted, manipulative physician who asks his secretary Johnson to join him in his sex research as an associate on the condition that she has sex with him. And Johnson agrees to his proposition without as much as flinching at its exploitative nature. Johnson's naivete, or should I say, sexual liberation, appears forced as it is hard to believe that a woman in the 50s fails to recognize unwarranted sexual advances, ev- even in the absence of the legal vocabulary of workplace harassment laws, which takes place only through the mid 70s. Johnson's non reaction is inexplicable and almost tests the viewer's relatability. The fear of being sidelined from the project maybe might have left Johnson with no choice, but the narrative doesn't grant her the interiority, and that could potentially let viewers witness an inner conflict before she accedes to Master's proposition. The opacity and spontaneity of Johnson's decision points at the series' underdeveloped understanding of sexual politics. In trying to distinguish its protagonist, Johnson, as being exceptionally self aware of her sexuality, the series surrounds her with other guileless women, Masters' neglected housewife, the provost's wife, who's unaware of her husband's sexual orientation, and their naive daughter, and so on. The series kind of overcompensates, projecting upon Johnson the present's own liberal sexual fantasies. Michelle Dean of The New Yorker writes that Johnson's character seems drawn from what the culture seems to want from liberation. A woman who has left the judgment of others behind, who doesn't give a damn, who in her new omniscience sees both the past and the future clearly, and is less likely less likely any recognizable human being who has ever lived. And these reckless projections deny women their basic, I feel they deny women their basic humanity. Um, One can find these kind of portrayals of sexual liberation in other period productions as well. Think about Pan Am and Playboy Club. These contribute to the imagination that sexual discrimination is a thing of the pre-60s past. And in these times of Me Too movement that has challenged the presence notions of sexual liberation, pointing at the pervasiveness of workplace sexual harassment and date rapes, these presumptions are inaccurate as well as dangerous for the cause of feminism. But not all period portrayals are this hopeless, and I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the TV series Mad Men, which grants its three female protagonists some degree of complexity and interiority, not so much because it sets out to be a feminist show, far from it. As you can see in the title, it's a story about men, about advertising men. But I want to argue that it is simply an effect of looking at the 1960s characters with a sense of temporal relationality rather than temporal distance. The moment we look at these characters as people, just like ourselves, the identification makes it hard to see or portray them as stereotypes. And this applies to portrayals of both men and women. But to zoom in on the female characters, here on the top right, left, sorry, we see Betty Draper, the suburban housewife figure in the series. But anyone who is familiar with the series would know that Betty is far from the innocent, guileless housewife stereotype. She's very aware of her broken marriage with Draper, and eventually finds a way out of the marriage and marries a man with political clout and old money. Other mechanisms that the series employ uh, uh, is following its characters to the privacy of their homes, and this it can afford because of its long run and serial format, of course. Mad Men opens up its frames to include scenes that are deglamorized and quite discomfiting. Viewers are often granted glimpses of the two working women representatives, Peggy Olson and Joan Holloway, at close quarters with their guards down, without makeup and vulnerable. Viewers are let in on Olson's loneliness, her emotional breakdowns in her apartment, and the images of Joan at home raising her boy with her mother. These scenes are far from glamorous. And Mad Men's accommodation of the unpleasant distinguishes it from other period drama series that we discussed earlier. The series also actively tries to stir clear of the boomer stereotypes associated with the 60s by populating its universe with people from different generations, thus opening up the decade to a diversity of experiences where each character navigates the 60s from their unique historical foothold. The protagonists in the series range from people born in the 19th century, and there are World War II veterans, Depression era Midwesterners, New York pre-boomers. And if you think about it, that is how any decade will look like, right? Filled with people from different generations and different temperaments. Um, the perceived proximity between the temporalities between the mid 20th century past and the present in productions such as Mad Men also forms the basis of demystification of the past. Then it is hard to build an aura around the past and to sell it as an object of nostalgic aspirations. Mad Men is, of course, not the only production set in the past that focuses on temporal relationality and is critical of the past. Films by Todd Haynes are even more sensitive towards portrayal of women. And again, it is because there is narrative empathy for its female protagonist. Katie Whittaker in Far From Heaven may ostensibly be the perfect suburban housewife, but she senses her husband's problems, or should I say, homosexual desires, and feels her confinement within the tightly knit white suburban community. With considerable emotional turmoil, she allows herself the desire for an escape and is even willing to continue with her frowned upon friendship with her black gardener Raymond Dagan. But Dagan tells her towards the end of the film that after the attack on his daughter by some white boys, he has learned his lesson and about mixing with white people and chooses to put an end to their friendship. So, what distinguishes these productions from other period ones is that they see the past as contiguous with the present, as being relevant for their present identities, but without nostalgia and without uncritical admiration for past icons. I call these retros, as the label of period drama fails to convey this reorientation of temporal relations. Their interest in the past doesn't motivate them to color correct the flaws of the past, like, let's say, the latest period drama Bridgerton, as Bridgerton does, which spuns this fantasy where race is simply not an issue in 19th century London, but where women still need men to chaperone them around. Or its opposite, the Queen's Gambit, where the female lead is a confident young woman. She enjoys meteoric rise in the world of chess dominated by men in the 60s, and her rise is virtually frictionless. She meets with no sexism let alone predatory behavior. I argue that these distorted representations of the past and its people come from a skewed understanding, or actually a non-understanding of temporal relations, just as skewed portrayals of women exhibit a lack of empathy and identification from its creators and consumers. I feel as long as individuals are made subservient to the grand narratives of male heroism or nationalism, or even the grand narratives of history, we will continue to get compromised characters and a distorted worldview. Um, I think perhaps the first steps towards a more representational world is to fight our reliance on stereotypes, to extend our affinities to people who are different from us in their skin color, gender, temporal location, and to open up and share the representational canvas, allowing people interior lives, agency, and the ability to feel the whole gamut of human emotions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, now would be the time to ask them. Again, you can ask them through the Q&A function with Zoom. But maybe a question from my side. You already talked a lot about how a lot of these productions that are set in the past, or in general, really, they tend to not only misrepresent, but also just not represent women at all. But what I was thinking is that especially, or even in shows or productions that tend to be better at it, like Mad Men, but also things like The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, for example, is one thing that I had to think of. I feel like there's a lot being said through the things we don't see, or through the contrast towards the female leads, because Joan Holloway and Peggy Olson and Mitch Maisel, they are all portrayed as being, strong and finding their way. But at the same time, that also creates a really stark contrast to the other women in that world. Because if you look at, the especially like the colleagues that the female coworkers that Peggy meets on her first day, there's a huge difference in how they are portrayed versus how the female leads are portrayed. So even though there are better portrayals, or there are better stories, and we get to see them outside of the frame and in their homes, there's also this other part. So this even, you know what I'm trying to say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, especially those women at the secretarial pool, or what do you call them? Those people who connect the telephone lines and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they once in a while they are sort of given these their moments. For example, there is this lawnmower scene where this woman, I don't know if I forget the episode exactly, then she gets some special yeah but more or less you're right. Until they are picked up, so to speak, let's say some secretary like Megan Draper later, because she's then made into a larger character, then she's given some interiority or so on. But before that, she was just part of the crowd. And so I say that, I mean, I at no point do I want to kind of give you the impression that retros have achieved the perfect portrayal, or but at least in these, because of, let's say, the few female protagonists, and they too are in the minority, you do see some glimpses of what future portrayals perhaps can be, where you give them some amount of complexity and so on. Yeah, but of course, not the entire cast gets equally the attention that yeah.
Yeah, and another thing you talked about that I found really interesting is to see that there is not really a learning curve to be observed. not only in like the way that women are represented, but also like more generally speaking in the film industry as a whole. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there is no really observable improvement in the, like the gender pay gap? Or, I mean, let's not even start about talking about people who are not, on the non-binary side of things, who are not, or who are represented even less than women in film. But also talking about skin color, gender, all that. Why do you think there's been so little progress, even in the light of movements like Me Too and feminism in general?
I mean, you're right, and I mean if at all there is a curve, it's just so almost negligible kind of the progress, but still one would have to acknowledge that, and the report that I showed there today, they talk about in terms of representation of Black women, one does see some progress, and also the skin tone. I think like with presence of people like Lupita, I think a few years ago you didn't even have that kind of a darker skin tone, right? We were quite all very happy with Halle Berry kind of skin tone. So maybe there is some amount of um, progress, and also like especially with Black representation, there are quite a few good directors, and you do get quite a few mainstream films where you have Black people maybe not always talking about slavery or racism. They don't always have to be kind of consumed by the same narrative of yeah. So I guess there is some amount of progress also with minority representation. Now you do come across some Asian people making movies about themselves. So yeah, maybe in a few years time there would be more. Yeah,
Here's
but there is
hoping.
no, but then one point that I wanted to say is that they have actually papers which show that uh, earlier they used to say that they didn't do this because these projects were not economically viable, that if you only had Black people, no one's going to go, or if you only had a female cast, no one's going to pay to see these movies. But these things have been proven wrong by the few films that have been produced. So we now know that if you have a film with equal like where the ratio is not so skewed, it does actually make more money than at least yeah. So on paper we do have that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think this leads perfectly into a question that just came from the audience. The question is, which group do you think holds the most power in changing the status quo? One that you already mentioned is us, the audience, because we decide which kinds of movies and series we watch, but there's also the producers or the male colleagues or maybe other groups that can influence what kinds of shows and what kind of representations are being shown in these kinds of productions.
It's a good question, and it's a difficult question. Um I don't know if I can like really say who exactly has more power, but if I were to make a conjecture, or let's say it's my take, I would say the audience now, with so much of with them actively kind of their registering their participation in social media, we do have a lot of say, far more than ever before, right? So let's say all these movements, the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter or whatever, so we there are so many ways that we can express our opinions and what we would like. And as I said, these things that would, these abstract notions that, oh, this film with only male or sorry, only female or Black people or whatever is not good. So we have ways to now show that no, if you do make a film, we are going to go, and people actively like, so I talk about paratextual cultures in contemporary film and television. So people have ways to express what we want to watch. And so in some sense, I think these things are, then there is this feedback loop, and and then producers and directors respond, or they are forced to respond to these. For example, if you look at the Academy Awards, they no longer can just kind of get away with just giving away the awards to white people, right? So whether be it like as a tokenism or whatever, but they have to now respond to these things. So I think the audience have emerged as a far more powerful group than ever before. And yeah, and of course there is also the point about a lot of there are a lot of young people who have gotten into movie making, people of color, minorities. So this also changes, I think, the general kind of landscape.
Yeah, but I think it's also interesting to maybe question that a little bit, because like, I think it's different, or it's an interesting question to think about whether we as the audience should, have that responsibility, or if there is a sort of obligation also on the side of those who make the movies to, not feed into stereotypes and not misrepresent minorities or in general groups of people. But maybe coming to another question that sort of tags along with the previous one, what impact do you think would the solidarity of male colleagues, for example, if they go on strike, if they boycott films with unequal representation or unequal pay, do you think that could make a difference? So talking about allyship?
Yeah, of course, I would think it cannot be. I mean, this whatever that we are, this thing that we are talking about has to be something that is shared by each and every member of the community, right? So so if the males don't continue to, let's say, be very comfortable getting or taking more money than their female colleagues, I think yeah, I don't see, at least it would take longer then if it's only the women's prerogative to fight out this fight. So allegiances are always important, but the question is, are the men going to be as comfortable giving up their age-old privilege, right? So these questions are actually not just it's something that we deal with in our everyday lives as well, right? So allegiances are always welcome, but can we form allegiances, or are these allegiances going to be so easy when we want to form it with someone who has traditional privilege? So um, but then I think because of social media, again, men are also very conscious of how they are portrayed, right? So nowadays you see that if you are a wife beater, or if you have any of these kind of things come out, you are immediately chucked from whatever productions, right? So these kind of things, although I'm not a very big fan of this kind of moral policing kind of thing, but it seems quite effective. And at least on the surface, then maybe men have more reasons to act in a certain way. It's quite sad, actually, the whole picture, but
Yeah, but I think let's hope that there is hope. Maybe coming to another question that just came in from the audience, citing Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, his latest movie, as an example. Why do you think misogyny and racism still go unnoticed in the claim to cult movies, or both present and past? So how can movies that have really bad examples of everything you just talked about, how do they still are runner-ups for big nominations or big awards?
I actually, to be honest, this Tarantino films, I mean, I just don't even know where to begin. It's like
he hides under this guise of being very stylistic. But I think it was this movie Django. No, no, not Django Unchained. What was this? Something eight. Uh,
The Hateful Eight.
the Hateful Eight. Oh my God! And the last scene in the movie where they just kind of it's not even some kind of abstract misogyny. There is like real violence on this woman for absolutely no reason, and it's kind of, it goes on and on and on without any rhyme or reason. And also in this Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Yeah, I actually have, I don't know how to even comment on these Tarantino movies. And also, apart from what he does in the movies, there have been allegations that he tried to, this was in this, I think, the Kill Bill movie, or one of these movies where he tried, I mean, they were just being so, um, they were completely reckless about having this female actor drive a car and not providing her with proper support, and which almost killed the star. But then, since he's such a big name, and so he kind of got around these things. So yeah, people like Tarantino has to go, but but then yeah, they're, I guess they have their audiences, and somehow these movies, and also because of their huge stature now that they are already big names, it's probably hard to yeah, yeah, get away, sorry, hard to put these men away. Although I think as an audience member, what you can do is probably not go and pay to watch these Tarantino movies. I don't know.
Yeah, I
That's what
guess that's
yeah.
the good thing about capitalism is that we, as the paying customer, we have a lot of power in making that decision.
Yeah.
But I mean, are there any like? I mean, you already mentioned Mad Men as being on the better side of things, but are there any directors, any production companies that you would say are on a good track and that we should be on the lookout for, and that can give us some more hope?
See, like, so I wrote this book on retro and feminism or representation of women. I don't directly deal with this topic, but as I tried to show in this talk as well, once you have uh, films which sort of just treats its characters with some degree of empathy, or you just treat them as human beings, I think you already are on a, let's say, better path, in the sense that it becomes hard to then show people as caricatures or as stereotypes. So not exactly maybe directly related to women's portrayal, but I do enjoy watching the Coen brothers films, uh, which which also have a very different take on history. They are not there to kind of, not there for nostalgia. They are very kind of um, idiosyncratic views of the past. And uh, yeah, and for example, this is not a retro, but Fargo is a good example where this character, the I forget her name, but you know, the police officer, she's a woman, and she's not at all glamorized, and she's also pregnant. So that's something that you don't see in films. So maybe things like that, where you are more interested in the character rather than, I mean, ideally in an ideal universe, to kind of get away from sexualization and so on, one should be focused more on the story, the individual, the character, right? And so there obviously can be a pregnant police officer solving a case, because you would come across that in real life maybe. But and she doesn't have to look pretty all the time and so on. So things like that, I think. Mm,
So I could only talk about the parameters maybe, but not really suggest production houses who are doing. But I think generally a lot of new movies, they are a bit conscious of how they portray women, I think. And especially if you steer clear of these big budget, uh, Tarantino, Scorsese, and so on, I think then automatically I think you're a bit in safer grounds.
Yeah, and I think as the further along this whole dialogue or this whole process goes, and the more people talk about it, the more indefensible it really becomes to not be aware of this. But would you say that embracing intersectionality even more in film would help with that? Because there's always sort of it's hard to trying to find the right words. A lot of the times when there's a show of intersectionality or minorities being represented, you get into the realm of people calling you out for having just a token character. But then on the other hand, like if you don't put people in your work, they are not represented at all. So
yeah, this is the same as like what I said, the problem with temporal relation, or like to understand the temporal distance. So either I understand what you mean. Sometimes there is overcompensation, or there is like absolute erasure, right? So, and I personally sometimes feel tired of movies like which have black protagonists, and they must always return to the story of slavery. I mean, for heaven's sake, everyone. I mean, not all Black people everywhere are stuck in this only singular narrative that kind of all encompasses them, right? So, yeah. But as I said, to answer your question, they are now making movies uh, like, let's say, Get Out. It does allude to slavery, but it's not entirely or completely set during the things like that. So there, I think you can find some smart representations these days. Similarly, I think with what is this name of this Eddie Huang's new movie, which is not released as yet. So there too, it's about Asian protagonist, but then it's not about the immigrant story directly. So things like that. I think in the coming decade, we should see more of these kind of, or for example, Aziz Ansari's, what was that TV series called?
Master of Nothing.
Yeah. So there too, it's not that every episode has to, I mean, these immigrants or these fourth generation immigrants also have interest, such as in Italian food and so on, apart from, let's say, what you expect, from the usual immigrant stories and so on. So I think in the future, I think there is hope. I think we will see some stories which better portray. As I said, if you think of these people as human beings, there would obviously be other interests and other trajectories, right? Other than this larger narrative arc that wants to put everyone in this, in its place.
Yeah. Do you think that the shift towards a stronger emphasis or a stronger presence of TV shows, of series, of long format productions is helpful in that? Because like it gives you a lot more room to like write between the lines, to put in more of that going outside of the just the standard frame and showing people outside of their just because like if you have a movie that is only 90 minutes long, you have to be a bit placative. There's no room to really build any depth to the characters. And with the shift towards more serialized entertainment, do you think that is an opportunity for story writers, for producers, for directors to tell stories with more depth?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't have the time today to go into detail, but in my book, I do talk about how, for example, Mad Men is able to um, sort of, as I said, broaden its frames. So because of its serial format and the long run, to kind of show you different facets or aspects of a person's life. So even though it's a series that is set in a workplace environment, but because of this extra leeway or space, it can kind of follow its characters to their houses. And also in terms of narrative arcs, like for example, you have let's say, I don't know if you're familiar with the Joan Holloway story, but let's say she works there for a long time, she finds a young man, and then you think, oh, there is a happily ever after kind of ending for her. But no, because the narrative can be stretched in time, you see that then she has a divorce and then she becomes a single mother, and her life's kind of struggle as a single working woman doesn't end with marriage or so on. So in that sense too, I think it gives space both ways, like in terms of a larger kind of canvas, both in terms of time and how do I say, scope. Yeah, that I think really helps.
Okay, thank you very much. As we are out of questions from the audience at the moment, I think this would be a good point to wrap up. I think the good thing to take away from this is that there is hope, that there are people who are trying to do the right thing, and there are productions that are trying to steer away from stereotypical or lacking representations. I'd like to thank you very much for your talk. I think I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about what I don't know yet. So there's a lot to keep learning as well. Thank you very much for being here and for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for watching and for sending in your questions. I hope you learned at least as much as I did. And I'm sure we will meet again for another talk on a similar topic again in the future. If you want to know more about what we do, you can find info on what we do in the description of the video or on our website. But thank you very much for being here. And I think
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Yeah, so thank you, everyone, and have a good night.